The millionaire sipped champagne as the maid's son stood trembling, violin in hand, then scoffed. Maids don't raise musicians, loud enough for the guests to laugh. Cameras turned. The boy didn't cry. He opened his case and said just 6 words, and the entire party froze. But what he played next silenced everyone. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The December sky hung heavy above the Hillcrest estate, gray clouds hovering like unsaid words. Inside the mansion's backyard, golden string lights wrapped around trimmed hedges, balloon arches towered above the manicured lawn, and a hired jazz band played covers of pop songs, while servers in black ties floated through the crowd offering sparkling cider to a sea of overdressed preteens and their beaming Quidditch parents. It was Christopher Belmont's 12th birthday, and his father Harrison Belmont, real estate tycoon, known donor to city elites, and proud member of the Westfield Golf Circle, had spared no expense. The laughter was loud, like it had something to prove. Laughter that didn't need to check its volume or apologize for its place. Children ran between rows of tablecloths stitched with silver threads, tossing footballs and chasing confetti. The adults clinked glasses while talking business disguised as small talk, IPOs, country club renovations, private school politics. And then he arrived. A small boy, slender, barely 11, stepped into the wide-open gate with a violin case gripped tightly in both hands. His shoes were clean but cheap, the kind that scuffed permanently after one wrong step. His coat looked a size too big, navy blue fraying at the cuffs, and his eyes scanned the crowd with the kind of quiet bravery that made him look older than he was. Elijah didn't walk in like he belonged. He walked in like he hoped no one would notice, but he was noticed immediately. A hush spread quickly among the kids. A few parents turned, their expressions tight with confusion. Some knew him vaguely. The maid's son, right? The one who waits in the back kitchen sometimes when his mother's on a double shift. But here in the open, with a case like that. "Is that Elijah?" one mother muttered with a hand over her mimosa glass. "What's he doing with an instrument? He probably thinks it's talent show day." A man snorted under his breath. Elijah caught the whispers but didn't slow. His heartbeat roared in his ears, but he walked straight toward the main table, where the cake stood untouched, and the birthday boy posed for photos. Harrison Belmont, in a charcoal vest and a smile that was more brand than emotion, spotted the boy from across the lawn. His face stiffened. "Elijah," Harrison called out, voice just loud enough to turn heads. "Son, you look lost. The staff's quarters are back that way." A few laughs followed, soft but sharp. Not children's laughs. Adults, the kind that aren't loud enough to be challenged but clear enough to cut. Elijah stopped. He looked toward the sound of the voice, blinking once. Then again. "I'm here for Christopher's birthday," he said, voice steady. "I want to play something for him. Just one piece." The backyard stilled. It was Althea, the Belmont's maid, who came running from the back porch. Her apron flapping, she grabbed Elijah's arm with urgency and panic all over her face. "What are you doing here, baby? You can't just... This isn't..." Her voice cracked mid-sentence. She wasn't angry. She was scared. Not of her son but of what he'd walked into. But Elijah didn't budge. "Mama, just one song." Harrison Belmont stepped forward now, a dozen eyes watching him closely. He straightened his cufflinks and gave a condescending smirk. "Son, this is a private party. This isn't one of those community events your kind gets invited to." The words landed heavy. "Your kind." Elijah flinched. Althea's eyes welled with heat and humiliation. A few guests exchanged uncomfortable glances, but no one said anything. That was Harrison Belmont, rich, respected, and ruthless. Speaking up meant risking something, and no one here was ready to risk anything for a maid or her boy. Christopher, the birthday boy, looked at Elijah with confusion and a strange curiosity. "He plays violin?" he asked aloud. Before anyone could stop him, Elijah knelt to the grass, popped open the latches of the old violin case, and opened it with both hands. The velvet inside was faded, but the instrument gleamed, not expensive, but clearly well loved. The boy lifted it gently, cradled it like it mattered more than anything else in the world. Gasps rippled through the crowd, not because of the violin itself, but because he was doing it right here, right now, without permission. The audacity. A maid's son playing like he belonged. "Elijah, stop," Althea hissed in a whisper, her voice trembling with desperation. "We'll lose everything." But Elijah wasn't looking at her. He looked directly at Harrison Belmont, and then gently but firmly, at Christopher. "You've never heard Silent Night until you've heard it this way." "Just 3 minutes, sir. That's all." Harrison scoffed. "This is not some street corner charity concert. Put that thing away and go back to wherever you—" "Let the boy play," said a voice. Firm. Clear. From the back. Heads turned. It was one of the grandmothers. Mrs. Penelope Ashcroft, known for donating the piano wing at Winteridge Academy. She stepped forward, face unreadable. "It's his gift to your son. If he's brave enough to bring it, we should be decent enough to listen." The crowd wavered. Harrison looked annoyed, but with so many eyes now on him, cameras raised, some even recording, he gave a tight, performative smile and took a step back. 3 minutes, he said through clenched teeth. "And then you leave." Elijah adjusted the violin under his chin, fingers trembling, not from fear but anticipation. He drew a breath, raised the bow. Click. The moment before the first note, before the sound, before anything, it all held still like the last breath before a storm. And then, just as the bow touched the string, a hand reached forward and yanked the instrument from his grip. Everyone gasped. Standing behind Elijah was Harrison's assistant, a tall man in a tailored suit, holding the violin like it was something diseased. "Party's over for you, kid." The backyard exploded in murmurs, gasps, and disbelief. But Elijah didn't cry. He didn't flinch. He stared at the violin in the man's hand, calm in a way no child should be after being stripped like that. "Then let me ask one question," Elijah said, eyes locked on Harrison Belmont. The crowd leaned in, and Elijah asked the question that silenced everyone, including the jazz band mid-song. "Would you have let me play if I wasn't the maid's son?" The question hung in the air like smoke after a firework, thick and uncomfortable. "Would you have let me play if I wasn't the maid's son?" No one answered immediately. Even the jazz band stood frozen, hands hovering above instruments, unsure whether to continue or disappear. Harrison Belmont's jaw tightened. For a man used to controlling rooms with donations and smiles, the silence felt like a challenge, and challenges irritated him more than anything else. He let out a short, humorless laugh, shaking his head as if Elijah had said something absurdly naive. "Son," Harrison said, his voice loud enough to carry across the entire lawn, "this isn't about race or class. This is about standards." He gestured vaguely at the violin, still clutched in his assistant's hand. "People like us invest years, generations into cultivating talent. You don't just wake up in a servant's house and become a musician." Althea inhaled sharply, as if someone had struck her. Her hands curled into fists at her sides, nails biting into her palms. She'd endured insults before, whispered comments about her accent, jokes about help, polite smiles that never reached the eyes. But hearing her son reduced to a product of her job cut deeper than any of that. She stepped forward, voice trembling but determined. "My son practices every night. He studies." Harrison cut her off with a raised hand. "Althea, please, don't embarrass yourself." Then he looked back at Elijah, his eyes cold and dismissive. "Maids don't raise musicians. They raise children who clean up after musicians." The words landed with a brutal finality. A murmur rippled through the crowd, louder this time. Some gasped, openly. Others shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting around to see who else had heard, who else might react. Phones were already out, not because people intended to defend Elijah, but because moments like this had value now, content proof. Something to post later with a caption like, "Can you believe this?" while doing nothing in the moment. Elijah felt his throat tighten. He had prepared himself for rejection, even humiliation. What he hadn't prepared for was how neatly those words sliced through everything he believed about himself. Not just that he wasn't welcome here, but that his very existence was a mistake, an overreach. He looked down at his hands, still shaped as if holding the violin, fingers trembling slightly. For the first time, doubt crept in, whispering that maybe he really was pretending to be something he wasn't allowed to be. Christopher Belmont shifted beside the cake table, his face pale. "Dad," he said quietly, tugging at Harrison's sleeve. "I just wanted to hear him play." Harrison didn't even look at his son. "This is not your concern," he snapped. "Go inside." The dismissal stung Christopher too, but he obeyed, retreating with confusion etched across his face. The party felt suddenly wrong, like a stage set after the play had fallen apart. Balloons bobbed in the breeze, painfully cheerful. The smell of sugar and grass mixed with the sour taste of discomfort. Mrs. Ashcroft opened her mouth as if to speak again, but Harrison shot her a warning look. "Penelope," he said calmly, "let's not turn a child's birthday into a political statement." That was when Althea broke. Her voice cracked, loud and raw. You don't get to decide what my son can become. Tears streamed down her face, but she didn't wipe them away. You see my uniform and think that's all I am. That's all he is. But you don't know the nights I stayed up listening to him practice after 12-hour shifts. You don't know the teachers who said he was gifted. Harrison exhaled sharply. Impatience etched into every line of his face. Enough, he said. Take your things and go, before you ruin this day any further. The assistant handed the violin back, without meeting Elijah's eyes. The instrument felt heavier now, like it carried the weight of everything that had just been said. Elijah closed the case slowly, deliberately, each click of the latch echoing louder than it should have. He didn't cry, he didn't argue. He simply looked up one last time. I wasn't asking for charity, he said softly. I was offering a gift. Harrison turned away, already signaling to the band to resume. Security, he muttered. Make sure they leave. As Althea and Elijah walked toward the gate, the whispers followed them, sharp and cruel. Did you hear what he said? She should have known better. This is why boundaries matter. A few parents avoided eye contact. Others stared openly, curiosity outweighing shame. No one apologized. No one stopped them. But as they reached the gate, something shifted. Elijah felt Althea's hand tighten around his. I'm sorry, she whispered. I shouldn't have let you come. He shook his head. I'm not sorry, he said, surprising even himself. His voice was quiet, but there was something new in it. Resolve, maybe. Or anger, finally finding its shape. Behind them, unnoticed by most, a teenage girl leaned against a hedge, her phone still raised. She had recorded everything. The insult, the silence, the way Elijah stood there absorbing words no child should hear. Her fingers hovered over the screen as she hesitated for just a second. Then she tapped upload. By the time Althea and Elijah reached the bus stop down the street, the video had already been shared 3 times. By the time they boarded, it had reached 100 views. And by the time the bus pulled away from the glowing mansion, a notification buzzed on a stranger's phone across town, carrying Harrison Belmont's voice, clear, unmistakable, saying the words that would soon follow him everywhere.
Maids don't raise musicians.
Neither of them knew it yet, but the silence he'd enforced in his backyard was about to be replaced by something far louder, and it had already begun. The Belmont estate was glowing with lights that night, but inside, the mood had shifted into something darker. Harrison Belmont paced across his home office, phone buzzing relentlessly in his hand. The clip had spread faster than wildfire, bouncing from one social media platform to another, titled with biting captions like "Millionaire mocks Maid's son" and "Racism in real time." The comment sections were brutal, not just angry, but relentless in tone. The hashtags "Dims let Elijah play" and "Maids raise musicians" were now trending nationally. Across town, in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment, tucked above a laundromat, Althea sat on the edge of her bed, elbows on her knees, the glow from her old phone casting long shadows on her face. The video had found its way to her inbox. From coworkers, old neighbors, even strangers. She watched it once. Then again. The clip wasn't long, just under 2 minutes. But it held everything. Elijah's courage, Harrison's disdain, her own voice cracking in front of everyone. It replayed her worst fear, her child being reduced to a label, a stereotype, and her being powerless to stop it. Elijah sat across the room, his violin case unopened at his feet. He hadn't touched it since the party. Not because of fear, but something harder to explain. A bruise in the soul, not the fingers. He didn't say much, just stared at the floor like he was still hearing those words. Maids don't raise musicians. By morning, news vans were circling the Belmont property like sharks. Reporters camped outside the gates, shouting questions as luxury SUVs drove past. Harrison avoided all press, but inside his anger boiled. He wasn't ashamed of what he said. He was furious that the world had heard it. This is cancel culture, he growled during a call with his lawyer. They're attacking me for telling the truth. That boy had no business crashing a private party. But even his allies were quiet now. The school board, once eager for his donations, delayed their meetings. Clients stopped returning calls. And that morning, one of his largest investors pulled out of a pending deal, citing ethical concerns. His empire was trembling, not from lawsuits, but from public perception. He needed someone to blame. And she was easy to reach. By noon, Althea received a formal notice from the Belmont household. Her services were no longer required. Effective immediately. No apology, No conversation, just an envelope and a warning that she had 1 week to vacate the small guest house behind the estate where she and Elijah had lived, rent-free as part of her employment. The letter dropped from her hands like it was made of stone. She stared at it, then at the empty wall in her kitchen, then back at Elijah, who had overheard everything. His face was unreadable. "They're kicking us out," she said, her voice so quiet it was almost a whisper. For what he said, for what they filmed. Elijah walked over, slowly, and picked up the paper. He read it in silence, then looked up with a calm that felt unnatural for his age. "He's punishing you because he couldn't shut me up." Althea pressed a hand to her chest, trying to steady her breath. She hadn't cried at the party, hadn't cried when she lost her job, but now the tears came, because it was true, because Elijah was right, because even when he stood tall, she was the one made to kneel. Later that day, her phone rang again, this time from a number she didn't recognize. Her hands were shaking when she picked it up. "Althea Thompson," said a soft female voice. "This is Denise Hallberg, principal at Fremont School of the Arts. Your son was recommended to us by a member of the Winteridge Academy faculty." Althea stood frozen. "We saw the video," the principal continued. "We believe Elijah has potential, and we'd like to formally invite him to audition for a special winter program. Full scholarship. Private mentorship included." Althea blinked, unable to speak. The woman went on. "There's one more thing. The guest artist for the program is a retired symphony concertmaster. He saw the clip and specifically asked to meet your son." A wave of disbelief hit her all at once. She mouthed the words concertmaster to herself as if afraid saying them aloud would make the moment vanish. But Elijah, hearing the one-sided conversation from the couch, didn't ask questions. He simply said, "Tell them yes." Althea stood on the subway platform with her arm wrapped tightly around Elijah's violin case. She held it like a sacred object, not because of its price, but because of the weight it now carried. Memories, pain, defiance, hope. The Fremont School of the Arts invitation had brought light into a week otherwise thick with anxiety. They were being pushed out of the guest house in 2 days. Her severance had been withheld under the excuse of contract violation. And though she'd applied for new cleaning jobs across town, responses were cold, hesitant. Harrison's influence traveled farther than she'd expected. But today, she refused to carry fear. She wore her best pressed blouse, the one she saved for church, and made sure Elijah's shirt was tucked in and spotless. The winter chill didn't bother her. The future was warming up. Inside the school auditorium, polished floors reflected ceiling lights like golden puddles. Everything felt sharper. The air, the way people moved, the way every door clicked closed like it mattered. Althea had cleaned places like this, not entered them as a guest. She watched as Elijah was led by an assistant through a side hallway toward the rehearsal room, violin in hand. She tried to sit in the audience seats, but her legs wouldn't stop bouncing. Too many memories fought to surface, memories she had never told Elijah in full. She had once cleaned for a man named Walter Kingsley, a retired concert violinist who lived in a modest brownstone on the Upper West Side. She'd worked for him for 4 years before he passed. Walter was a grumpy widower with no children, no family, just a creaky house full of records, violins on walls and a piano he hadn't touched in years. But Althea remembered how, the first time she brought Elijah with her, no daycare that day, the boy stood quietly, eyes glued to a violin resting in glass. When Walter saw him, he hadn't smiled. He simply asked, "Does he listen?" Althea had nodded. "Listens better than most grown folks I know." And just like that, the lessons began. She never told anyone. Not because she was ashamed, but because it had felt too sacred, too fragile to explain. A poor boy being taught Bach and Tchaikovsky by a man who once played for presidents. Elijah's fingers were small back then, but precise. The sound he created wasn't loud, but it had weight. Walter never praised him. He didn't need to. The lessons were the praise. Now, watching her son step into a room filled with high-end music equipment, she remembered something Walter once told her while drying a wine glass. "Your boy doesn't play like he wants applause. He plays like he's seen pain." It made sense now. In the rehearsal hall, Elijah sat with 5 other students, all dressed in polished uniforms, each holding expensive instruments with engraved initials. The girl beside him glanced at his scuffed case and wrinkled her nose slightly, whispering something to the boy on her left. Elijah heard it, the way people speak when they think whispers protect their cruelty. He didn't react. Instead, he reached into his case and pulled out a sheet of music, handwritten by Walter himself. Not printed, not digit ink faded. margins annotated with personal notes, like breathe slower here and don't chase the applause, let it come to you. The guest artist entered, tall, elegant, black, mid-50s, with a quiet authority. His name was Miles Kavanagh, once the youngest concertmaster in the San Francisco Symphony, now a legend retired after an injury left his hand partially paralyzed. When his eyes landed on Elijah, he tilted his head with curiosity. "You're the boy from the video," he said, not mocking, not amazed, just recognizing something. Elijah nodded. "Play." No introduction, no warm-up, just a request. Elijah stood, adjusted his shoulder rest, closed his eyes, and began to play Walter's version of Adagio for strings. The room shifted. The notes weren't loud. Not yet. They came like a soft apology to a cruel world, every stroke of the bow carrying pain, resistance, truth. The other students, even the ones who whispered, stopped moving. Miles didn't blink. And outside the soundproof glass, Althea pressed her hands over her mouth, trembling. Her son wasn't just playing, he was confessing. He poured everything into the strings, the humiliation, the anger, the aching pride he held for his mother. The violin wasn't just wood and strings, it was the only language left to speak the things no one would say out loud. The final note lingered long after his bow stopped moving. The silence afterward was deafening. Miles finally spoke, voice low and certain. That wasn't student-level playing. He stepped forward and took the sheet from Elijah's stand, examining Walter's handwriting. His eyes softened. "Where did you get this?" "My teacher," Elijah replied. Before he passed, Miles nodded slowly. This man was no ordinary teacher, and neither are you. But just as Miles turned to the assistant to schedule Elijah's main recital appearance, a tall woman in a sleek blazer walked in. She looked flustered but authoritative. "Sorry to interrupt," she said, "but there's been a concern about the boy's enrollment eligibility." Miles narrowed his eyes. "What concern?" The woman glanced at Elijah with practiced diplomacy. "He's not on the official scholarship roster. There's been a complaint from a board member." Althea, still watching through the glass, felt a chill race down her spine. Miles crossed his arms. "I requested him personally." "I understand," she replied, "but unless we receive clearance by the end of today, he won't be permitted to perform at the winter showcase." Elijah's hand tightened around the violin neck. Althea rose from her seat like she'd been struck. Outside the rehearsal room, a black SUV idled across the street. Inside, a call was already being placed from a restricted number, and Harrison Belmont's voice would soon be heard on the other end. The marquee lights of Winteridge Academy glowed against a December dusk that felt more like anticipation than cold. Music students in tailored coats hurried through the frosted stone archway, their breath patterned in white clouds, violin cases in hand like portals to futures they had already been promised. Posters of poised young musicians, mostly from affluent generational arts families, lined the entrance corridor. Winteridge Christmas Recital, a celebration of tradition, excellence, and legacy. None of them bore the face of a black boy in a faded jacket, and none of them were meant to. The invitation that had arrived at Althea's cramped apartment, delivered mistakenly, everyone assumed by the school office, was like a melody sung out of key, surprising, fragile, and unsettling. Althea stood near the grand double doors, her hand clutched around her son's elbow as if afraid he might vanish under the weight of so much expectation, and whispered judgment. Her son Malachi held his violin case with quiet authority, as though the slender instrument inside was less wood and strings, and more like truth incarnate. The gala ambiance, threaded with candlelight reflections and elegantly dressed parents, seemed to orbit a different world, one where Malachi's presence felt like a discordant note begging to be resolved. But this was his moment too, if only the academy would allow it. The hush that fell over them was immediate, when the Winteridge gatekeeper, a rigid woman with steel-rimmed glasses and an unwavering posture, approached. Her lips were thin, her eyes colder. "There's been an error," she said, without preamble, as though the air itself had given her authority. "This recital is for enrolled students only. We cannot permit outsiders to perform." Her voice had the finality of a verdict, and those assembled began to murmur, some curious, some disapproving, most interested in the drama unfolding rather than the boy himself. Malachi's fingers tightened around the violin case handle, as if the grip might anchor him to his own truth. He looked up at her, his voice steady though his pulse raced like staccato notes in a scale. "I was invited," he said simply. "I was told to be here." The gatekeeper's eyes slid to the slender paper in Althea's trembling hand. The recital invitation, official and pristine, embossed with the academy's crest, The contradiction in her professional poise was minute but present. A ripple of confusion passed through the crowd. Whispers like tangled harmonies spread from parent to parent. An error. Are you sure he's on the program? Some averted their eyes, uncomfortable by the disruption of their expected perfection. Others watched with the thinly veiled hunger of those who crave spectacle. None, though, seemed to step forward on Malachi's behalf. He's not a Winteridge student, the gatekeeper repeated, her voice firmer, as though repeating it might convince reality itself. Mistakes happen. You must understand this is tradition. Behind her, the taste of mulled cider and the shimmer of festive orchestra banners stood in stark, ironic contrast to her cold logic. Tradition, it seemed, was a fortress, one that did not welcome those it had never intended to include. Althea's heart pounded against her ribs like a drum in a funeral march. She felt the air thin, as though the privilege of the academy pressed down on her chest, refusing to let her breathe freely. This recital was more than a stage. It was a symbol of legitimacy, and Winteridge was the gatekeeper of that legitimacy. If Malachi was denied here, what doors would never unlock again? For a moment she saw not the faces of the affluent families, but all the silent barriers he had already faced. Every stereotype, every clipped opportunity, every whispered dismissal. Malachi stepped forward then, his voice soft but unshakable. "If I'm not meant to be here," he said, eyes sweeping the corridor like a bow preparing to draw, "then tell me what I am missing." Whatever expectation lay in that question hung like a suspended note, vulnerable, raw, and unflinching. A ripple of discomfort passed through those near enough to hear. It was one thing to witness exclusion from the edges. It was another to hear a young boy call it by name. Someone shifted behind him, a distinguished music teacher, known for her composure and influence in the academy's whispered political undercurrents. Miss Rowena Tremaine was someone whose approval could elevate a career and whose disapproval could quietly consign a musician to insignificance. She had watched Malachi since his arrival, first with curiosity, then with an intensifying spark that suggested recognition of rare talent. Ms. Tremaine cleared her throat, her voice breaking the fraught silence. "I want to hear him play." It was not a request. It was an invocation. Heads turned, gasps fluttered like startled birds. The gatekeeper's expression tightened. "Miss Tremaine," she said, coldly professional. "The program has already been finalized. There is no provision for additional performers." Rowena's posture shifted. She lifted the violin case from Malachi's hands, with an ease that suggested both protectiveness and certainty. The crowd leaned in, sensing something unfolding that was bigger than discomfort, bigger than class lines, and larger than tradition alone. Rowena rested the case on the polished piano beside her, and her eyes, steady and unyielding, met the gatekeeper's. "I won't stand for exclusion based on a technicality, not when there is genuine talent before us," she said. Her words carried weight, but more than that, they carried conviction. Whispers surged like gathering wind. Many in the crowd looked horrified at the challenge. A performance slot meant for someone never intended to be there. Others looked amazed, as though this was the moment something long overdue was finally breaking open. Parents exchanged looks that teetered between outrage and admiration. Children watched riveted, sensing the electric charge of change. The gatekeeper stepped back, her authority now unsettled. "This is highly irregular," she said, almost to herself. "We have procedures." But Rowena's calm refusal to relent was a kind of force majeure. She signaled to the stage manager, the same woman who had once guided Malachi's mother through an impromptu backstage tour weeks prior. Curious about his music, dismissing it then as quaint. Now, however, her eyes widened with the irony of her own earlier negligence. An unexpected hush swept through the room, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. The piano's varnished surface caught the gleam of chandelier light, and Malachi's violin case sat at its side like a promise waiting to be claimed. For the first time that evening, the tension was not about exclusion, but about the fear and wonder of possibility. And just as the first flutter of applause began to rise, an undecided, fragile ovation, like the tremor before a crescendo, something unexpected happened. The recital's host, a wealthy trustee whose family reputation was sewn through the fabric of Winteridge's legacy, stepped forward and murmured into Miss Tremaine's ear. Her eyes widened, then narrowed, not with defeat, but with an expression that hinted at a revelation no one yet understood. The crowd fell absolutely silent again. What he whispered was too quiet for the audience to hear, but the look on Miss Tremaine's face told everyone that whatever came next would append everything they thought they knew about tonight, about tradition, and about who truly deserved to be heard. The stage lights burned hotter than Elijah expected. They washed the room in a pale gold that felt almost judgmental, revealing everything at once: his borrowed black slacks, the slightly oversized janitor's jacket he'd kept on because no one offered him a proper concert coat, the scuffed shoes that whispered his class before he ever played a note. The audience shifted as he stepped forward, hundreds of polished faces tilting in unison, curiosity mixing with discomfort. No announcement followed him, no credentials, no applause, just silence, thick and watchful. From the second row, Althea clasped her hands together so tightly her knuckles ached. She noticed the jacket immediately and felt a wave of quiet fury rise in her chest. They had dressed her son like the help, even now, even here. It was subtle, everything about Winteridge was, but it was deliberate, a reminder of where he came from and where they expected him to return once the music stopped. Behind the curtain, Miles Kavanagh stood rigid, arms crossed, eyes locked on Elijah. He had fought for a slot on that stage, but he hadn't won the war. This was a test, not of Elijah's talent, but of how far the institution could push him without breaking him. They were watching to see if he would shrink. Elijah didn't. He set the violin beneath his chin, adjusted the bow, and closed his eyes. For a brief moment, the room faded. The chandeliers, the velvet seats, the people who had already decided who he was. In that quiet, he saw Walter Kingsley's living room again. Dust in the sunlight, old records stacked in crooked towers. A man who never spoke about race, but taught him discipline, like it was survival. He heard his mother's voice, after long shifts, tired but proud. He remembered the backyard laughter, the words that cut, the humiliation that still lived in his chest. Then he played. The opening note was low, aching, not polished, not decorative. It carried weight, like it had somewhere to go. The piece wasn't on the program. It was an arrangement Elijah had rewritten himself, stitching together fragments of Bach, spirituals Walter had once hummed, and something raw that belonged only to him. It wasn't rebellion in volume. It was rebellion in presence. The audience stilled. At first, a few brows furrowed. This wasn't what they expected. Not bright, not safe, not ornamental. It demanded attention. The sound filled the room slowly, deliberately, forcing itself into the spaces people usually reserved for comfort. A woman in pearls lowered her program. A man near the aisle leaned forward, confused by the ache rising in his chest. Even the ushers froze in place, hands hovering near their radios. Elijah's bow moved with precision. But his face told another story, one of restraint, barely holding back emotion. He wasn't performing for approval. He was releasing something that had been trapped too long. Each phrase bent toward memory, toward pain, toward dignity stolen and reclaimed. The music didn't beg to be liked. It insisted on being heard. Margaret Hollis shifted in her seat. She had expected competence at best, embarrassment at worst. What she felt instead unsettled her. This wasn't background music for donors. This wasn't youth talent meant to be molded. This was accusation, wrapped in harmony. By the time Elijah reached the center of the piece, the room had changed. No one coughed. No one whispered. The silence between notes grew heavier, as if everyone was holding the same breath without realizing it. Althea felt tears slip down her face, unashamed. She recognized the rhythm. The nights Elijah practiced quietly so neighbors wouldn't complain, the way he played when words failed him. This was her son, speaking fluently in a language they had tried to deny him. And then in the back row, a man stood up abruptly. The scrape of his chair echoed like a crack through glass. Harrison Belmont didn't clap. He didn't shout. He simply gathered his coat, jaw clenched, eyes burning with something between rage and disbelief. He had arrived late, slipping into the auditorium unnoticed, expecting to confirm what he already believed, that this was all spectacle, that the boy would falter without charity or control. Instead, he was watching the narrative slip from his hands. "This is inappropriate," Harrison muttered to no one in particular as he moved toward the aisle. "This isn't what this stage is for." A few heads turned. Murmurs rippled. Recognition sparked. The man from the video. The one whose words had gone viral. The one who thought he owned rooms like this. But Elijah didn't see him. He was deep in the final movement now. Fingers flying. Bow pressing harder as the melody swelled into something fierce. The sound rose. Not loud, but undeniable. Until it felt like the walls themselves were vibrating. This wasn't defiance shouted. It was defiance sustained. Harrison reached the exit and paused, glancing back one last time. For just a fraction of a second, his eyes met Althea's. There was no apology there, only resentment, that she and her son had refused to stay small. He pushed the door open and left. The door closed behind him with a dull thud. The sound carried, so did the silence that followed. Elijah's final note hung in the air, trembling, unresolved. He held the bow still, eyes still closed, letting the sound fade on its own terms. When he lowered the violin, the room remained frozen, not in confusion, but in awe.
No one clapped.
Not yet. From backstage, a stage manager leaned toward Margaret Hollis and whispered urgently, "That donor just walked out. Harrison Belmont. He funds half the winter program." Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. Her gaze stayed on Elijah, standing alone under the lights, breathing hard but unbowed. And then, from somewhere in the middle rows, a single hand came together. One clap, sharp, defiant. Margaret turned toward the sound, her expression darkening, because she recognized the clapper, and she knew exactly what it meant for what came next. The morning after the recital, Winteridge Academy's auditorium was still being talked about like a battlefield, not because of a fight, but because something sacred had been shaken. The echo of Elijah's final note hadn't just haunted the crowd, it had begun rippling into the city's upper crust like a dropped stone into a polished pool. But while social media lit up with admiration, praise and sudden interest in the boy who played like a veteran, not everyone was celebrating. Inside the oak-paneled dining room of Westfield Country Club, Harrison Belmont sat with 3 members of the State Symphony Board, his espresso untouched and his voice low but forceful. The club was his comfort zone, a place where voices never rose, and racism never had to name itself. It was where concerns were voiced in code, where lineages were protected not by law but by legacy. "I'm just saying," Harrison said calmly, folding his napkin with surgical care. "We can't afford to dilute the image of the Winteridge pipeline. This boy, Elijah Thompson, he's not affiliated with any accredited program. No documentation, no pedigree, no sponsor." One of the men, Arthur Langston, shifted uncomfortably. "But Belmont, didn't he already play the showcase?" That audience ate it up. "That audience doesn't write the checks," Harrison said, his smile never quite reaching his eyes. "We do. And if we're going to open the stage to walk-ins, we need to make sure we're not sending the wrong message." "And what message is that?" came a voice from the next table. Harrison froze, his head turning slightly. He hadn't noticed anyone sitting so close. A man stood slowly, well-dressed, middle-aged, black, with a presence that didn't ask for space but claimed it quietly. He carried himself like someone who'd seen too much to be impressed, and too little to be afraid. There was a pause as members of the table recognized him. Dr. Charles Wynn, former concert pianist, widower, quiet philanthropist. He stepped forward with his drink in hand, resting it lightly on the edge of the Belmont table. "I'm just curious," he said, voice smooth but laced with challenge. "What exactly is it about the boy's background that you find concerning?" Harrison straightened his shoulders, catching the glances from the other men, now suddenly unsure. "It's not personal," he replied quickly. "But when a child with no track record is given stage time meant for vetted talent, it raises questions." Dr. Wynn nodded slowly, then pulled out a chair at their table, uninvited, and sat. "I remember when I was 10, he said. Played at a church recital. Wasn't meant to, just filled in for someone who didn't show." Man in the back row said, "He plays well for a street kid. That man was on the board of a youth orchestra. I never got invited again." He paused. "He said the same words you just did. He's not one of us." The table went still. "You're twisting this," Harrison said, trying to smile. "This is about standards." "No," Dr. Wynn replied. "This is about fear. You saw that boy steal the room without credentials, without connections, without your blessing. And you hated how easy he made it look." Harrison's jaw twitched. Dr. Wynn stood again, this time addressing all of them. "You want a background check? Fine. Let's start with the basics. Raised by a single mother. Worked after school. Practiced in silence. Learned from a man no one else bothered to remember. And despite all that, he played better than anyone you've coached this year." He turned directly to Harrison now. "You tried to crush him once in front of your guests. Didn't work. Now you want to block him with paperwork. But I'll tell you this, that boy, he's going to play again. And this time, it won't be at your country club's mercy." Without waiting for a response, Dr. Wynn walked away, drink still in hand, but the room left behind him humming like he'd just conducted a symphony in conversation. Back at the table, Arthur cleared his throat. Maybe we should reconsider pushing for that background check. This could spiral. It already is, Harrison muttered, finally lifting his espresso. But it had gone cold. Later that evening, Althea received a call from the Regional Music Society. Elijah has been nominated for the State Youth Symphony Showcase, the woman said, her voice tight. But there's been a formal request for additional screening from one of the benefactors. Althea didn't even have to ask who. As she hung up, Elijah looked at her from across the room. They're still trying to erase me. She didn't respond with comfort this time. She just nodded. But outside their apartment, in a car parked 2 houses down, someone was watching. And in his hand was a photograph from years ago. One that connected Althea to a story long buried. A story even Elijah didn't know yet. The photo had been taken decades ago, but it still burned with a kind of truth that made people nervous. Walter Kingsley, young and proud, stood beside a woman the world never accepted. Her name was Delilah Warren. Soft-spoken, sharp-eyed, and unapologetically black. They had fallen in love at a time when such love was more dangerous than poetic. It wasn't the music world that rejected them first. It was Walter's own blood, his family, his patrons, and every society circle that once applauded his genius, now turned their backs the moment she walked into a concert hall with his last name. Althea stared at the photograph in her hands, breath caught in her throat. She hadn't seen it in years, not since the day Walter had quietly tucked it into her work apron, whispering, "Keep this, not everyone's supposed to forget." Back then she didn't know what he meant. Now the weight of the moment crashed down on her. The woman in the picture was Delilah, and she wasn't just Walter's wife. She was Althea's aunt, her mother's sister, the connection they had kept quiet, not out of shame, but out of survival. Althea had grown up with the whispers that Delilah had married into a world that spat her back out, that she had moved north and lived quietly with a man who once played for presidents but died in obscurity. But what no one ever told her was that Walter hadn't abandoned the family. He had chosen them. He had mentored Elijah not because he pitied him, but because he recognized something familiar, a continuation of love, blood, music. Now, years after Walter's death, that history had returned, not in reverence but in threat. The violin, his Garneri, an instrument older than most nations, had been left to Elijah in a handwritten amendment, but Harrison Belmont had funded a legal challenge, bringing forward a man named Calvin Rothschild III, a distant cousin with a last name but no memory of Walter. They claimed the will was invalid, that Walter had been mentally unfit, that a poor boy, the maid's son, had manipulated a dying man. But this wasn't about the violin's price. It was about what the violin represented: ownership, legitimacy, and legacy. Giving Elijah that violin meant rewriting the story that only the elite were meant to inherit. And that was unacceptable to people like Harrison. Althea sat at the kitchen table, fingers trembling as she held the letter from the court. It confirmed the hearing. No more delays. No more excuses. They had one shot to prove the will's authenticity, and she had one chance to reveal the truth she had never told her son, that his connection to Walter wasn't just built in music. "Elijah," she said quietly, looking across the room. He looked up from his music notebook, blinking. "There's something you should know about Walter." He watched her closely, sensing the shift in her tone. "He wasn't just your teacher. He was family. He was married to your great aunt." Elijah's brow furrowed. "Wait, what?" "Delilah. My mother's sister. She married him when the world didn't want them together. His family disowned him. They said he'd ruined his bloodline. He lost everything, concert bookings, patrons. But he stayed. He chose her. He chose music over money. And when she died, he became a ghost to his own people." Elijah didn't speak for a long time. He stood, walked to the counter, and stared at the violin case. "So all those times I thought he saw something in me, it wasn't just talent." "No," Althea said, her voice thick. "It was legacy. You were part of her, and he never stopped loving her." The revelation should have brought warmth. Instead, it added weight to the case, to the silence, to the courtroom waiting just days away. When they entered the courthouse, reporters swarmed like vultures. Cameras clicked, microphones thrust forward. Headlines were already being written. "The maid's son fights for a violin worth millions." No one cared about the story behind it, only the drama. Inside, the defense was polished and precise. Belmont's team painted Walter as senile, disconnected, possibly manipulated. They presented Rothschild as the rightful heir, listing a dozen cousins who hadn't spoken to Walter in decades, but now claimed deep emotional connection. Althea took the stand first. He didn't just teach Elijah music. He taught him how to carry pain without letting it destroy him. That violin wasn't a gift. It was a passing of the torch. But there's no video, no notarization, no filing, the opposing lawyer pressed. Why should the court believe this? Althea's voice didn't rise. It deepened. Because no one fakes a relationship that consistent. Not when it's built in silence, in patience, in love. He left it to Elijah, because Elijah was the only one who knew how to listen. Elijah was next. He walked slowly to the witness stand, violin in hand. Why do you believe Walter wanted you to have that instrument? The lawyer asked. Elijah looked straight ahead. Because he didn't see me as a student. He saw me as his continuation. You can't fake connection through sheet music. You feel it, the opposing lawyer scoffed. And how exactly is the court supposed to feel that? Elijah didn't respond, but the judge leaned forward. Perhaps we should. And then Elijah was asked to play. And what the courtroom didn't know was that inside that violin case, beneath the velvet lining, tucked under the rosin and spare strings, was the original will, the signed, sealed, notarized version Walter had given to Althea in secret, just days before his final hospital visit. But it had gone missing. Until now. As Elijah took the violin from the case, his hand brushed something. A folded envelope, a signature in faded ink, and the words to be opened if they try to erase him. The courtroom hadn't yet noticed what he held, but Althea had, and the defense attorney was about to be handed something that would turn the trial upside down. The courtroom wasn't grand. It was cold, beige, and smelled faintly of paper and old varnish. The kind of place where people like Althea had never been on the side of power. The judge sat elevated behind a wide oak bench, peering down like a gatekeeper of legacy. And the jury, though instructed to remain neutral, couldn't hide their curiosity each time they glanced at the boy sitting quietly in the second row, violin case resting beside his feet like a relic caught in a war. It didn't start. Elijah wore a white shirt buttoned all the way to the top, the same one he'd performed in weeks ago. It didn't fit as well now, slightly tighter across the shoulders, as if even his clothing was struggling to keep up with how much had changed since that night on the Winteridge stage. He sat still, hands folded, his face unreadable, not numb, just focused, the way someone becomes when they realize their voice won't be heard, so they make silence speak louder. At the front of the room stood the petitioner, Calvin Rothschild III, a distant relative of Walter Kingsley, pulled out of obscurity by lawyers who needed a name, any name, to challenge the will. His suit was expensive, but it didn't fit him. He looked uncomfortable, even bored, but his lawyers weren't. Harrison Belmont had funded them personally, not for the love of Rothschild, but to make sure Elijah didn't own the one thing they hadn't been able to silence: the violin. They called it a contest of inheritance. But it wasn't about family. It was about gatekeeping. About making sure a boy like Elijah didn't walk away with something valuable that couldn't be explained by charity or pity. Althea sat beside her son, back straight, palms pressed to her skirt to stop them from trembling. She had told Elijah the truth days earlier, that Walter had changed his will 6 months before he died, leaving the violin to Elijah by name. Not to a student, not to a friend, but to Elijah Thompson, son of Althea. But the original copy had gone missing. All they had now was a scanned file, and Belmont's lawyers were arguing it was forged. The judge, a gray-haired man named Delacroix, known for being strict and by the book, tapped his gavel lightly. "Proceed," he said to the defense. The opposing counsel, a polished man in his 40s, stood and began a carefully measured attack. "Your Honor, we are not disputing that the boy studied with Mr. Kingsley. What we are questioning is the legality and validity of the so-called amended will. A will that conveniently leaves a priceless 18th-century Carnegie violin to a non-relative, without notarized witness signatures, and without any public record of filing." He turned, slowly, to face Elijah and Althea. "Now, I'm not suggesting fraud," he said, his voice softening in mock concern. "But we must consider, was Mr. Kingsley, in his final months, of sound mind, or was he manipulated by a young, emotionally persuasive student?" Gasps echoed from a few rows back. Althea's jaw clenched. Elijah didn't move. The judge raised a hand. "Let's keep conjecture out of it." But the words had been said, planted like a seed in the minds of the jury. Miles Kavanagh was seated behind them. He'd come, uninvited, to show support, to be a presence, not as a celebrity, but as a witness. and when he stood and asked permission to speak as a character reference, the courtroom shifted. "I was there," he said plainly. "I saw that boy play with that violin. I've played that very model myself. It was worn in the exact places. Walter's hands would have touched it. You don't fake wear and tear like that. That violin belonged to someone who loved it, and Elijah didn't play it. He honored it." The judge nodded slowly, but said nothing. The opposing counsel raised objections, pointing out that sentiment was not proof. Kavanaugh was dismissed politely but firmly. Then came Althea's turn. She stood on the witness stand, shoulders squared, and told the story that had been waiting to be heard. How she had cleaned Walter's house for years. How Elijah would sit in silence on the floor while she worked. How Walter noticed and began to teach him, not out of obligation but awe. She spoke of Walter's change, the softening, the handwritten lessons, the quiet mentoring that went far beyond notes and scales. And then she handed the judge a letter, Walter's final note, one she had kept hidden even from Elijah, out of fear it would be used against them. It was a short letter, signed in shaky handwriting, dated just 2 weeks before Walter passed. "If the world doesn't recognize this boy's talent, it deserves to lose him. Give him my voice. Give him the violin. It always belonged to him." The courtroom fell quiet, but the judge didn't look moved. He glanced over the page, adjusted his glasses, and finally spoke. "This letter may suggest intent, but it is not a legal document. As much as I sympathize with the circumstances, I must base my ruling on admissible evidence and procedural legitimacy." Elijah's heart sank, not in panic, in disappointment. This wasn't just about a violin. It was about erasure, again, about being told that what was already his, earned, lived, held, still didn't count, unless someone else validated it. The judge cleared his throat. "I will take this under advisement," he said. And then, just as he was about to adjourn the session, he paused. His gaze shifted to Elijah. "There's something strange about all this," Judge Delacroix said slowly. "When I was a young man, I studied piano at Juilliard. Not many people know that. I wasn't very good, but I had an ear." He looked at the violin case. That model, Guarneri. You say it's been played by this boy." Miles stood again, this time without permission. "Yes, Your Honor. It's the only instrument he's ever known." The judge leaned back, tapping his chin. "Then I want to hear it." Murmurs erupted. "Excuse me," said the defense attorney. "I said I want to hear him play it. Here, in this courtroom. If that violin was truly his teacher's, and truly meant for him, then it should sound like it's home." Althea's breath caught. Elijah looked up, stunned, and the judge gave one final order. "Bring the instrument forward." The room hadn't expected music, but music was coming. The shelter smelled like old soup and tired dreams. It was the kind of place where fluorescent lights never fully dimmed, and privacy was measured in curtain dividers, not walls. Christmas was 3 days away, but the only ornaments were paper cutouts taped to cracked drywall, and the only carols came from a static-filled radio in the staff kitchen. Althea sat on the edge of a thin mattress, knees pulled close to her chest, her coat still zipped because it was warmer than the donated blanket folded at her feet. Elijah lay beside her, silent, his violin case clutched like a shield even in sleep. They had only been there 2 nights, but it felt longer. The eviction from the Belmont estate had come fast and merciless. No warning, no discussion. Just a typed notice taped to the servants' quarters, with cold legal language, and a forced smile from the house manager. "It's not personal, Althea. Mr. Belmont just can't afford distractions right now." That was the final line before the locks were changed, and her years of loyalty were erased like chalk from a board. She hadn't begged. Not once. Not when she carried boxes of Elijah's clothes through the side gate. Not when she asked the bus driver for mercy on a fare. Not when she lied to her son about how it's just temporary, baby. But now, in the dark of the shelter, the silence pressed against her like shame. Not because of where she was, but because of who had put her there. The courtroom hearing had ended in confusion. The judge had ordered a recess to verify the envelope. Elijah discovered the missing will Walter had written by hand and sealed beneath the violin velvet. But Belmont's lawyers had immediately contested it, demanding a full handwriting analysis, citing possible forgery and emotional manipulation. The violin remained with Elijah, but the ruling was sus and pending, undecided, just like their lives. Now, with Christmas lights blinking mockingly through frosted windows, Althea replayed the past month like a cruel symphony. Her son had gone viral for the wrong reasons. humiliated by a man who never saw him as more than her shadow. Then he performed his way into respect, only to have that respect questioned, legally challenged, and turned into another form of exclusion. The violin wasn't just a possession, it was the last piece of dignity they hadn't lost, and it was still hanging by a thread. "Elijah," she whispered, gently brushing a curl from his forehead. "I'm sorry." He stirred slightly but didn't wake, just shifted closer, his fingers tightening on the violin handle even in sleep. Down the hall, someone coughed. A child cried softly behind another curtain. The world outside continued to spin, uncared. Althea didn't sleep that night. She stared at the ceiling, counting every crack, her mind racing through backup plans she didn't have. She had applied for 3 jobs that week, one as a laundromat attendant, one at a diner, and one cleaning offices overnight. None had called back. She couldn't blame them. Employers Googled names now. Her son's story was everywhere, and so was Harrison Belmont's version of it. By morning, the shelter staff had set out a small tray of boxed cereal and lukewarm coffee. Elijah picked at a slice of banana, still silent. The music inside him had dimmed over the last few days. Not disappeared, just withdrawn, like it was waiting for something. At 8:43 a.m., the knock came. It was crisp, confident, too firm for a shelter visitor. Althea froze mid-sip, her paper cup trembling. Another knock, this time followed by a voice. "Miss Thompson, it's Andrea Flores, Channel 11. Althea blinked, unsure if she had heard correctly. "We're here about the violin case. And your son." Elijah sat up. Althea opened the door slowly. A woman stood just outside with a cameraman behind her, both of them bundled in heavy coats, their breath forming puffs in the cold. The reporter held a folder in one hand and a wired microphone in the other. "I'm sorry for showing up like this," Andrea said, her tone softer than expected. "But we just got confirmation from a source inside the courthouse. The envelope your son found? The will? It's real, legally filed and previously misplaced by Kingsley's former estate lawyer. A copy surfaced this morning through a court clerk's review request. It matches the original exactly. Every word, every signature." Althea's knees nearly buckled. Andrea continued. "The court will likely rule in your favor. We wanted your reaction, if you're willing to speak on camera." Elijah stepped forward, wide awake now, his eyes locked on the reporter. But Althea didn't answer right away. Her mind raced, not with relief, but with caution. Because if this news was out, if the will had surfaced, then someone else already knew. Someone who wouldn't let go of control so easily. And sure enough, as the camera crew began setting up in the shelter hallway, a sleek black car turned the corner outside the shelter parking lot. Tinted windows, government plates, and inside a passenger in a long coat with a briefcase in his lap, and a document that bore a seal no one expected to see this early in the morning. It wasn't just a court decision anymore. Someone from higher up was stepping in. The offer arrived not with a knock, but with an envelope slipped quietly beneath the shelter's front desk. Thick, cream-colored stationery. No return address, just Althea's name, handwritten in looping cursive, that reminded her of old piano sheet margins. Elegant, patient, precise. Inside was a formal invitation, embossed in gold. The Elijah Thompson Fund, created not by a known organization, but a silent donor who had watched the boy's story unfold, and chosen to intervene. It offered Elijah a fully funded invitation to audition at the Carnegie Hall Youth Winter Showcase, one of the most prestigious stages in the world. No strings attached, no requirements but one: prove you deserve to be heard. Althea read the letter 3 times, standing in the shelter hallway while fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. She didn't trust things that came without warning. Life had taught her that help rarely arrived without a price. But Elijah, reading over her shoulder, didn't hesitate. "They think I'm ready," he said quietly. Althea turned to him, her voice taut. "No, baby. They want to see if you still are." Within 24 hours, they were moved to a temporary apartment. Small, clean, donated by the same anonymous fund. Elijah received new sheet music, rehearsal time at a local music center, and a note that read, "Bring the violin that speaks your truth, not the one they want to hear." That line stuck with him. It felt like something Walter would have said. But as word of the opportunity spread, so did something else. Rumors. Whispered suspicions that someone didn't want Elijah to succeed. The shelter staff mentioned unfamiliar cars, parked outside. The music center received calls inquiring about Elijah's prior conduct. A volunteer quietly told Althea that a man had shown up asking to inspect the violin for insurance purposes. She didn't need to ask who sent him. The closer Elijah got to the audition, the louder the doubt became, not from within, but from around him. Whispers that he was a media story, not a musician, that he was the face of a moment, not the owner of a movement. And still, he practiced. Every morning, every night, not for perfection, for proof. The audition was scheduled for December 27th, just 2 days after Christmas. Carnegie Hall itself loomed like a giant memory. Polished marble, towering arches, velvet seats built for legacy. It wasn't just a place to perform, it was a place to belong, or to be reminded that you didn't. That morning, Elijah dressed in the navy jacket Walter once gave him, patched and carefully re-sewn by Althea the night before. He carried the violin case like it was an extension of his spine. Althea walked behind him, praying not just for success, but for safety. She had lived long enough to know that sabotage doesn't always wear teeth. Sometimes it wears suits. Backstage, the other youth musicians buzzed with nervous excitement. Teenagers in designer shoes tuning $30,000 violins, whispering about conservatories and legacy scholarships. Elijah stood at the edge of the room like a shadow, unnoticed by most, except one. A girl named Brielle, 15, blonde, tall, leaned over as he opened his case and smirked. "That's vintage," she said, feigning admiration. "Cool story. Did you buy it from eBay?" Elijah didn't respond. He'd heard that tone before, casual cruelty disguised as curiosity. Instead, he focused on the strings, checking each one as he always did. Careful, methodical, precise. Everything looked normal. Everything felt right, until he stepped onto the warm-up stage and drew his bow across the D string. It snapped. Not the string, the sound. Flat, off-pitch, dead. He froze, heart pounding. He checked the pegs, then the bridge, then the fine-tuners. But something was off. The strings looked the same, but they didn't feel the same. The resonance, the soul, was gone. Backstage, Althea sensed it. She leaned forward, eyes narrowing as Elijah's bow hovered in the air, confused. He wasn't choking, he was realizing. Something had changed. He tried again. The A string screeched like metal on glass. Then he knew. Someone had swapped the strings. They looked identical. Same brand, same gauge. But the tension, the feel beneath his fingers, was wrong. This wasn't his setup. It wasn't Walter's tone. It was sabotage. He stepped off the practice platform, his face flushed with quiet panic. "Mama," he whispered when she met him in the hallway. "Someone changed them." Althea's mouth went dry. "What do you mean changed? They're not mine. They're cheap copies." Dead tension. "I can't play with these." Althea's mind raced. "Can we find the originals? Did you notice anyone near your case?" Elijah shook his head. It was closed. But someone had time. A voice called from the hallway. "Contestant 7. Elijah Thompson." Stage left. Althea gripped his arm. "You don't have to do this." Elijah's eyes didn't flinch. "Yes, I do." He turned, case still in hand, walking toward the stage. But just as he reached the curtain, a shadow stepped out of the side hallway. An older man in a black coat, with a long gray beard, and a strange familiar face. He wasn't part of the staff. He didn't wear a badge. "Elijah," the man said softly. "Wait." The boy stopped. His heart jumped. The man reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a cloth bundle. "I've been watching," he said. "You don't know me, but I knew Walter. He was my teacher too." He opened the cloth 4 strings, neatly coiled, labeled in Walter's own handwriting. "Use the ones he trusted." Elijah stared, speechless, and the stage manager's voice echoed again. "You're on. Final call." With no time to tune, no time to test, Elijah had to choose risk everything with strings he didn't trust, or play blind with strings passed through memory. He reached for the bundle. 13. The Christmas Recital. When silence spoke louder, word count 1. Carnegie Hall had never felt like this before, not on Christmas. The velvet curtains shimmered under golden chandeliers, the lobby buzzing with guests in gowns and tuxedos, murmuring about stocks, politics, and winter homes. But tonight, the air carried something different. Not elegance, but electricity. Everyone had heard the story. Some had seen the videos. A few had even tried to stop it. But none of it mattered now, because the boy was here, and he was opening the most exclusive Christmas recital of the year. Elijah sat backstage, alone, his violin resting on his lap. The auditorium on the other side of the curtain pulsed with anticipation. Not for a celebrity, Not for a headline. For him. Not as a victim. Not as a viral sensation. But as an artist. His fingers hovered above the strings. Not trembling. But waiting. He remembered what Walter once told him on a winter morning long ago, as he tuned the Guarneri by hand. Real silence isn't the absence of sound. It's the moment before the truth is spoken. And tonight Elijah was going to speak. He wore no formal tuxedo. No white bow tie. Just a black shirt, a dark blazer, and the patched coat Althea had sewn with her own hands. His only accessory was the weight of the words that had followed him through every hall and courtroom, every audition and rejection. Maids don't raise musicians. That phrase spat at him with cruelty and certainty. Had become the title of his opening piece. The lights dimmed. The stage assistant gave a soft nod. He stepped out. No announcement. No prelude. Just the soft creak of his shoes across polished wood and the shocked silence of hundreds of high society guests realizing who was walking onto the Carnegie stage first. Elijah positioned the violin beneath his chin, closed his eyes, and let the first note rise. Low, mournful, aching. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't polished. It was real. The melody began as a whisper, almost hesitant, like a child peeking through a locked door. Then came the second movement, harsher, sharper, mimicking the words he remembered so vividly, the ones that stung more than they should have. The crowd leaned in, visibly confused. This wasn't a Christmas carol. It was protest in minor key. Then, just when the melody felt like it would collapse under its own sorrow, Elijah changed pace. He layered in a hymn, faint, almost invisible, the same one his mother had once hummed while cleaning Belmont's marble counters. Go tell it on the mountain, but slowed, twisted, woven into the rhythm of defiance. By now the crowd was breathless. Not one phone buzz. Not a single cough dared interrupt. The wealthy parents, the board members, the very people who had whispered behind closed doors about overexposure and media charity cases, now sat frozen, their defenses quietly dismantling, because what they heard wasn't just music. It was guilt. It was grace. It was the sound of someone who had been locked out, playing his way through the front door. In the second balcony, a woman clutched her husband's arm. He's playing that line, she whispered. He's turning it into music. The judges in the VIP box didn't speak, but one of them removed his glasses and wiped his eyes. Althea, seated near the back in the shadows, couldn't even cry. She just watched, her heart full and breaking at the same time. Her baby wasn't performing. He was telling their story. Without a single lyric. Without a single word. As the final movement began, Elijah did something unexpected. He slowed the tempo down to almost a crawl, letting every note fall with the weight of memory. And then, softly, hauntingly, he introduced the line again. Maids don't raise musicians. Not as an insult this time, but as a motif reborn. He played it like a lullaby, like a dare, like truth. And then he stopped. No dramatic finish. No flourish. Just a final fragile note, held in the air like a breath. No one wanted to exhale. He lowered the bow, and the silence was thunderous. No one moved. The moment held like it didn't want to end. Then, a single clap. From the third row. Sharp. Deliberate. It broke the tension like glass shattering on marble. All heads turned. And there, rising to his feet in a tailored gray suit, was Christopher Belmont, Harrison Belmont's son. Now 16. Taller. Leaner. His face more serious than the boy who once watched Elijah get humiliated at a birthday party he barely remembers. He didn't say a word. He just clapped again. Then others followed. Row by row, applause began to rise. Slow at first, hesitant, like people still asking permission. Then stronger, unified. It wasn't just clapping. It was surrender. The entire hall stood, one by one, until even the most resistant hands had no choice but to join. Elijah didn't bow. He simply stood there, eyes scanning the crowd, until they landed on Christopher. The boy nodded once. Elijah nodded back. But just as the crescendo of applause reached its peak, something strange happened. Near the side curtain, a tall man in a navy overcoat slipped inside the wings. He wasn't staff. He wasn't a musician. He carried a leather folder and wore an expression far too serious for a recital. The stage manager whispered something, then rushed to Elijah. "You need to come with us," she said, gently tugging at his arm. "What is it?" Althea asked, already moving from the audience. The manager hesitated. "There's someone here. From DC." Elijah blinked. "From where?" But before she could answer, the man in the coat stepped forward, not to speak but to open the folder. Inside was a formal seal, and a personal letter, addressed to Elijah Thompson, from the office of the First Lady of the United States. 12 redemption in broken strings. Word count. Elijah's fingers trembled, not from fear but urgency, as he coiled off the cheap sabotaged strings from his violin and replaced them with the bundle passed to him by the old man in the hallway. Walter's handwriting on the labels was unmistakable. His careful curves and tiny notes like fingerprints frozen in time. There wasn't enough time to tune them properly. Not under pressure, not with his name echoing through the theater as the final call. The audition clock ticked louder than ever. He had seconds, not minutes, to make a decision that could alter his future forever. The new strings were alive with unfamiliar tension, stiff with cold and unpredictability. Each turn of the peg creaked like history shifting. Elijah could feel the eyes of onlookers nearby, confused judges behind the curtain, rushed stagehands whispering into earpieces, and Althea at the edge of the hallway praying without speaking. He met her eyes for a brief moment, and in that look they shared everything: fear, hope, rage, and the memory of all the doors that had slammed in their faces. He stepped onto the stage, no tuning, no perfect prep, just instinct. The lights above Carnegie Hall were blinding, and yet the moment felt intimate, as if the hall had shrunk, folding in on itself to center this one boy and the battered violin in his hands. Elijah didn't bow to the judges. He didn't smile. He simply nodded once, raised his instrument, and closed his eyes. The first note came out sharp, too sharp. It was raw, unbalanced. A gasp rippled across the judges' table. One leaned forward. Another scribbled something in a notebook. But Elijah didn't stop. He shifted, adjusted the bow pressure, and let the violin speak for itself. He didn't play the piece he had prepared. Instead, he created something, right there, on the spot. He stitched together a story made of melody, fragments of Walter's teachings, notes he remembered from his mother's humming in the kitchen, chords he'd practiced in silence on nights he cried into his pillow after being told he didn't belong. His fingers moved not with precision, but with conviction. It wasn't clean. It wasn't perfect. It was real. And slowly, that imperfect music started to bend the air. The second movement was softer, a requiem, almost, delicate phrases built on hesitation, rising gently like steam from a winter street. The audience stopped shifting. Even the stagehands behind the curtains fell still. The judges, once poised with pens, now let their hands fall flat. Their eyes remained locked on this boy, dressed in a hand-stitched jacket, and performing like he had nothing left to lose. Because he didn't. Tears welled in Althea's eyes. This was more than an audition. It was survival. Every note was a rebuttal to the lie that he was only special because of the internet, because of pity, because of viral sympathy. This was him declaring he didn't need anyone to tell him he belonged. He just did. Then came the final passage. A trembling tremolo that whispered rather than roared. It was a goodbye to fear, to silence, to the idea that music could only belong to those born into it. Elijah let the last note hover, then fall. Not crash, just fall. And when it ended, the room didn't erupt. It exhaled, like it had been holding its breath. A full 8 seconds passed before a single clap began. Then another. Then a rush. Not polite applause, but emotional release. Not performance praise, but witnessing. Some of the judges were visibly shaken. One wiped her cheek discreetly. The panel head, an elderly composer with decades of gatekeeping behind him, stood and simply nodded. Elijah walked off stage before they could ask questions. He didn't need their words. But as he stepped back into the hallway, heart pounding, shoulders heavy with both victory and fatigue, he was met not with cheers, but with a shadow. Harrison Belmont, standing in the narrow corridor like a wall, arms crossed, jaw tight, eyes colder than the marble steps outside. "You think that changed anything?" he asked, voice low, calm, dangerous. "That wasn't talent. That was spectacle. You're still nothing more than a moment." Elijah didn't flinch. He kept walking. But Harrison stepped in front of him again. "I still have friends on that board," he continued. "You might have gotten your applause today, but when decisions are made in closed rooms, people like you don't make it to the next stage." Elijah stared at him, chest rising slowly. "I didn't come here for the next stage," he replied. "I came to make sure people remember the last one." A silence stretched between them. Then Harrison leaned in closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "Keep climbing. I'll be there when you fall." Elijah didn't answer. He didn't need to, because behind Harrison, walking briskly down the hallway, was the old man from before, the one who had given Elijah the strings. But this time, he wasn't alone. Behind him was a woman in a navy suit, holding a portfolio, flanked by a security staff member, carrying a sealed letter. They weren't from Carnegie. They were from something much higher, and they were coming straight for Elijah. Carnegie Hall had never felt like this before. Not on Christmas. The velvet curtains shimmered under golden chandeliers, the lobby buzzing with guests in gowns and tuxedos, murmuring about stocks, politics, and winter homes. But tonight the air carried something different, not elegance but electricity. Everyone had heard the story. Some had seen the videos. A few had even tried to stop it. But none of it mattered now, because the boy was here, and he was opening the most exclusive Christmas recital of the year. Elijah sat backstage, alone, his violin resting on his lap. The auditorium on the other side of the curtain pulsed with anticipation. Not for a celebrity, not for a headline, for him, not as a victim, not as a viral sensation, but as an artist. His fingers hovered above the strings, not trembling, but waiting. He remembered what Walter once told him on a winter morning long ago, as he tuned the Carnegie by hand. Real silence isn't the absence of sound, it's the moment before the truth is spoken. And tonight, Elijah was going to speak. He wore no formal tuxedo, no white bow tie. Just a black shirt, a dark blazer, and the patched coat Althea had sewn with her own hands. His only accessory was the weight of the words that had followed him through every hall and courtroom, every audition and rejection. Maids don't raise musicians. That phrase spat at him with cruelty and certainty. Had become the title of his opening piece. The lights dimmed. The stage assistant gave a soft nod. He stepped out. No announcement. No prelude. Just the soft creak of his shoes across polished wood and the shocked silence of hundreds of high society guests, realizing who was walking onto the Carnegie stage first. Elijah positioned the violin beneath his chin, closed his eyes, and let the first note rise, low, mournful, aching. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't polished. It was real. The melody began as a whisper, almost hesitant, like a child peeking through a locked door. Then came the second movement, harsher, sharper, mimicking the words he remembered so vividly, the ones that stung more than they should have. The crowd leaned in, visibly confused. This wasn't a Christmas carol. It was protest in minor key. Then, just when the melody felt like it would collapse under its own sorrow, Elijah changed pace. He layered in a hymn, faint, almost invisible, the same one his mother had once hummed while cleaning Belmont's marble counters. Go tell it on the mountain, but slowed, twisted, woven into the rhythm of defiance. By now the crowd was breathless.
Not one phone buzzed.
Not a single cough dared interrupt. The wealthy parents, the board members, the very people who had whispered behind closed doors about overexposure and media charity cases, now sat frozen, their defenses quietly dismantling. Because what they heard wasn't just music. It was guilt. It was It was the sound of someone who had been locked out, playing his way through the front door. In the second balcony, a woman clutched her husband's arm. He's playing that line, she whispered. He's turning it into music. The judges in the VIP box didn't speak, but one of them removed his glasses and wiped his eyes. Althea, seated near the back in the shadows, couldn't even cry. She just watched, her heart full and breaking at the same time. Her baby wasn't performing. He was telling their story, without a single lyric, without a single word. As the final movement began, Elijah did something unexpected. He slowed the tempo down to almost a crawl, letting every note fall with the weight of memory. And then, softly, hauntingly, he introduced the line again. Maids don't raise musicians. Not as an insult this time, but as a motif reborn. He played it like a lullaby, like a dare, like truth. And then he stopped. No dramatic finish. No flourish, just a final fragile note, held in the air like a breath no one wanted to exhale. He lowered the bow, and the silence was thunderous. No one moved. The moment held like it didn't want to end. Then, a single clap, from the third row. Deliberate. It broke the tension like glass shattering on marble. All heads turned, and there, rising to his feet in a tailored gray suit, was Christopher Belmont, Harrison Belmont's son, now 16, taller, leaner, his face more serious than the boy who once watched Elijah get humiliated at a birthday party he barely remembers. He didn't say a word. He just clapped again. Then others followed. Row by row, applause began to rise. Slow at first, hesitant, like people still asking permission. Then stronger, unified. It wasn't just clapping. It was surrender. The entire hall stood, one by one, until even the most resistant hands had no choice but to join. Elijah didn't bow. He simply stood there, eyes scanning the crowd, until they landed on Christopher. The boy nodded once. Elijah nodded back. But just as the crescendo of applause reached its peak, something strange happened. Near the side curtain, a tall man in a navy overcoat slipped inside the wings. He wasn't staff. He wasn't a musician. He carried a leather folder and wore an expression far too serious for a recital. The stage manager whispered something, then rushed to Elijah. "You need to come with us," she said, gently tugging at his arm. "What is it?" Althea asked, already moving from the audience. The manager hesitated.
"There's someone here from DC. Elijah blinked. "From where?"
But before she could answer, the man in the coat stepped forward, not to speak, but to open the folder. Inside was a formal seal and a personal letter, addressed to Elijah Thompson, from the office of the First Lady of the United States. The applause had become a wave, not just of sound, but of surrender. It rolled through Carnegie Hall like a tide no one could stop, washing away every smug whisper, every side-eyed doubt, every carefully constructed hierarchy that had once stood between a boy and the stage. And yet, in the middle of it all, one figure remained seated. Harrison Belmont, stone-faced, hands resting on his lap, unmoved. The same hands that once waved Elijah away from a birthday party lawn like he was dirt tracked in from the street. The same mouth that once said, "Maids don't raise musicians," now pressed into a line of bitterness so tight it could draw blood. He watched as people who once laughed behind his back now rose to their feet for the boy he tried to erase. Harrison stood, not to clap, but to leave. He exited quietly, coat folded over his arm, steps tight and controlled, but Althea saw him from her seat in the back. And for the first time in her life, she didn't lower her eyes. She watched him leave like someone watching the end of a fire, not celebrating, not gloating, just surviving. And beside her, Elijah stood still, as the ovation continued long after the music had ended. It wasn't about the notes anymore. It was about the silence they had shattered. Backstage, as the final act prepared, Elijah sat in the green room, still in the same patched blazer, Walter's violin resting beside him, like a quiet companion. The man in the navy coat from DC stood just across from him, holding a letter that now sat, unopened, in Althea's lap. She hadn't read it aloud yet. She just kept staring at the seal. "It's not a joke," the man said gently. "The First Lady watched the recital. Live stream. She's been following your case since the video went viral. Said she saw her own son in you." Althea blinked, unsure whether to cry or laugh. Elijah remained silent. Not from fear, from disbelief. "We'd like to invite you both to the White House," the man continued. "There's a special New Year's Eve cultural event, youth artists from all over the country. She wants you to close it. And she wants your mother sitting front row." Althea gasped. "Why now?" she asked. The man didn't hesitate, because the world finally stopped and listened. Still seated in the corner, Miles Kavanagh stepped forward, clearing his throat. "It's not a gift. It's a crack in the walls, and you earned every inch of it." Elijah looked up. He didn't smile. He just nodded. That night, as the audience funneled out of Carnegie Hall, phones buzzed and headlines exploded. From shelter to standing ovation, Elijah Thompson brings down the house. Maids do raise musicians. And they raise the roof too. White House invites violin prodigy after viral recital stuns nation. But somewhere in the Belmont estate, far from the stage, far from the roar of applause, Harrison Belmont poured a drink alone in his private study. The fire crackled. A framed newspaper clipping of one of his earliest business awards tilted slightly on the wall. His phone buzzed on the desk. A new message from the Westfield Donors Circle. "Subject regarding your future board position." He opened it and read the first line. "After careful consideration, we've decided to move in a new direction." The screen dimmed. Outside, snow began to fall over the city, and miles away, in a modest two-bedroom apartment, where the heater still groaned and the windows didn't quite shut, Althea finally exhaled. She folded the letter from the White House carefully and placed it on top of Elijah's sheet music. The past month had nearly broken them. But tonight, the world had bent. Instead, Elijah stood at the window, watching flakes drift through the orange glow of the streetlights. His violin rested nearby, strings finally holding steady again. "Mom," he said quietly. "You think he heard it?" Althea looked up from the stove where she was warming canned soup. "Who?" "Mr. Belmont," she thought for a moment, then smiled without bitterness. "He heard every note, baby. And now he can't unhear them." But before Elijah could respond, there was another knock at the door. Firm, Confident. Althea froze. Elijah moved to open it. And standing there wasn't a camera crew, or a donor, or even a neighbor. It was someone they hadn't seen in years. Someone Althea thought had vanished. And in her hands was a violin case. One Elijah had never seen before. The woman standing at their door was older now. Her posture not as straight. Her eyes dimmed with time. But Althea recognized her instantly. Ms. Lorraine Bennett, once Walter Kingsley's housekeeper before Althea had taken over. She hadn't seen her in years, not since the funeral, when Lorraine vanished from the crowd before anyone could ask where she'd been, or why she left. But now she stood in the hallway of Althea's tiny apartment, holding a violin case wrapped in fabric so old it looked like it had survived a century. Althea blinked. Lorraine? The woman nodded. Her voice when it came was softer than memory. He left it with me. Told me to bring it to your boy, if he ever made the world stop and listen. Elijah stepped beside his mother, his gaze shifting to the case with curiosity and quiet reverence. Lorraine slowly unwrapped it, revealing a violin, unlike any he'd seen. Darker wood, intricate engravings along the neck, and on the underside of the tailpiece, the initials DWK, Delilah Warren Kingsley. Walter had kept his wife's violin, and now, her legacy, as much a ghost in the story as Walter himself, was being handed to the boy who carried her blood in his fingers. This one's not for the stage, Lorraine whispered. This one's for the soul. Elijah didn't ask questions. He just nodded once and took it gently, like it might fall apart in his hands. But it didn't. It felt right. The next few days unfolded like a dream, wrapped in disbelief. News anchors debated his impact. Artists reposted his recital footage. Music programs across the country opened scholarship slots, and quietly behind the scenes, Elijah received word that his White House performance had been selected to close the televised New Year's broadcast. A national stage, unlike any he'd stood on before. But what struck Elijah most wasn't the calls or interviews, it was how people were finally seeing Althea. Not as a maid, not as the woman in the background, but as the reason he existed at all. A feature on national TV, titled The Woman Who Raised the Music, opened with grainy footage of her walking Elijah into a community center. Another showed her steaming his shirts, patching his coat. Photos of her sweeping mansion floors, intercut with him holding standing ovations. The story wasn't just about the boy anymore. It was about the mother, and the myth she quietly dismantled. At one point, a journalist asked Elijah during a panel, "Where do you draw your resilience from?" He didn't hesitate. "From a woman who built a world out of things she was told she didn't deserve." Another asked, "Was it hard being raised by a maid?" This time he smiled, calm, but cutting. "I wasn't raised by a maid. I was raised by Althea Thompson." Her name made the room go quiet. Not out of offense, out of awe. The memoir deal came 2 weeks later. A respected publisher, national release, dual authorship, raised by a maid, notes between the silence. The story would be told, not just in Elijah's words, but Althea's. Each chapter would alternate, hers capturing the nights, the fears, the hands blistered from bleach, his capturing the sound of those fears turned into harmony. But the first chapter didn't start with their struggle. It started with the quote, the one that haunted them, the one that almost crushed them. "Maids don't raise musicians." That was the chapter title, and beneath it a single line, "But one of them did." The publishing deal went viral before the ink dried, but not everyone celebrated. Behind high doors, Harrison Belmont watched the announcement on his office TV. The same man who had once controlled boardrooms now couldn't control a single narrative. His name was now attached to footnotes. The man who said it, the man who tried to stop him. His calls went unanswered. His invitations to panels declined. And when he stepped into country clubs or black tie events, the whispers followed. He didn't lose everything, but he lost the thing he valued most: control. Meanwhile, Elijah prepared for the White House performance with a kind of calm that belied his age. He didn't rehearse for perfection anymore. He rehearsed to remember, every note now layered with moments he'd lived. Hands that shaped him, words that nearly buried him. On New Year's Eve, the East Room filled with officials, artists, and families. The First Lady greeted him personally. She didn't speak to him like a celebrity. She called him by name. She called Althea by name. And when the lights dimmed and Elijah stepped to the center of the room, holding Delilah's violin, not Walter's, not the one the courts had battled over, but the one history tried to erase, the world didn't blink, because by then they knew not to look away. And just before the bow touched the string, Elijah looked out at the rows of power, wealth, legacy. He spotted a familiar face in the third row, Christopher Belmont, still watching, still clapping, but this time, with pride. And just as Elijah took his first breath to play, a hand slipped into his Althea's steady, warm present. Because this wasn't just music. It was their answer to everything that tried to silence them. And from the very first note, the room understood. This wasn't the end of a story. It was the overture to a world where legacy wasn't inherited. It was built, quietly, brilliantly, by the hands of those no one saw coming. If you believe no child should be judged by where their mother works, type yes in the comments. Would you have clapped or walked out if you were in that recital hall? Don't miss stories that speak truth to power. Subscribe for more, because the silence around injustice only breaks when we choose to listen.